I've been asked in recent times by colleagues to give them a copy of a book we wrote some time ago called The Virtual University, an action paradigm and process for workplace learning. And it got me to read the book again and think about it and realize that actually I am still driven all these years later by its principles, practices, I guess, underlying philosophy. And I thought I'd just take a few moments to talk about kind of where it came from and why I believe it's still relevant. Um, we were at a time really in the 1990s of transition. So the book was published in 1998. It went on to sell out and be reprinted. Kind of such was the interest at that time in, I guess, the emerging virtual world and how it might be harnessed really to the betterment of people's lives, work in companies, organizations, etc. And it was a time really of great innovation, as this time is. And we kind of knew we arrived. I knew we'd arrived when my brother-in-law was sitting in the dean's office at a university interview, and there was a copy of the book on the desk. And you think, well, wow, it's starting to reach places where maybe it could make a difference. So the first exposure to these ideas really for me came in Gordon Will's book from around 1992 or three called Your Enterprise School of Management. And I'd moved from petrochemicals into publishing, was a head of department initially. And really, this was the experiment which was carried out in our organization. So, in the flowchart I have on the slide there, which is central to the book, how can managers questioning the future be encouraged to take experiments, take action, make a difference? And there'd also be a feedback, a learning loop, a knowledge capture loop. And then that was responsive. And it was kind of like an adaptive organization. And personally, I was very influenced too by Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, which I didn't really quite understand initially. And it took me a while. And I heard him speak in Chicago, and a little bit later, and the penny sort of dropped. And that was interesting too, like a systems-wide approach to organizational learning. But I found Your Enterprise School of Management easy to think about, easier to explain. And around that time, we're working with some fairly towering intellects, I think, really, Charles Majerusson, who was developed the team management systems and many other things in terms of positive psychology later on. And Alan Mumford, famous for his Learning Styles questionnaire, and again, really putting some meat around this action learning process that we all espoused, believed in, lived, which was that people really learn best at work if they're workers. They can make a real difference to their organization. They can solve complex problems in small groups. And if they put equal attention to learning as they do to the problem solving, that becomes a virtuous kind of activity. Initially, in the mines with Reg Evans in the 50s, boosting productivity. So this was very much in our psyche. And for me, listening to Senge, Henry Mintzberg, I started to see it in a kind of wider context, but I was in this lived experiment really from 93, 94 onwards. And that was the model really to take. We worked for a company called MCB University Press at the time, which became Emerald Publishing Group. And that was the model, the dynamic adaptive systems model that enabled the organization to move into the digital world, a digital future, which was not scary, but emerging and strange and uncertain, back in the early 90s. We collaborated with really the authors of the book with me, Richard Tier and David Davis, who for me were a kind of revelation, almost these young Turks really within academia, maybe railing against the system, sometimes being listened to by the system, but envisaging a different future for universities and organizations in academia, in this space of developing people, developing managers, developing leaders, harnessing knowledge. And they lived in a world of academic credit, academic politics, academic decision-making, but building frameworks around things, looking at, again, the total system approach. And out of that came, what Richard Badgery, the University for Industry, which initially for the hospitality and tourism industry globally, with major clients like Marriott and others that became the focus of our next book, actually. But in 1997, I drew on an early model from a year earlier in an article I published called How to Build a Robust Corporate University. And if I'm being charitable, I'd synergized. I'd been a little bit of a magpie, pulling together ideas. And what fascinated us about the virtual world was how it could enable things. Our real fascination was with part 2 of the title, which is an action paradigm and process for workplace learning. That's really what drove us. And we saw the virtual world as a way to get resources to people and libraries and knowledge, working in that space, to create what we called forums at the time, communities of practice online, discussion areas, to have courseware for learning, hyperlinked to what was out there of various knowledge types, traditional, non-traditional, etc. Realizing that the knowledge world was kind of exploding in terms of publication, even in those early days of dial-ups and pipex and those sorts of things for internet access, and very difficult conditions in terms of speeds and so on. And we also saw, Richard and David also saw that actually organizations could be generators of new knowledge that would impact the academy as well as their people in a way that I don't think has really taken off and been captured quite the way it could. Even 25 years on, really, from their publication, which was in 1996. So for me, it was like a brilliant time to be alive, really, as we try to create the systems and frameworks for quite a different world of learning, and to try to build different organizations. So we'd realize that the history of organizations is that they decline, they become stale, they decline, and they don't remain the dynamic, active systems that they could be or maybe needed to be in terms of the big transitions that are faced. So that's something we, still believe in. So kind of what's the relevance now, as I was rereading, some of my work now has moved on. Some of it's organizational, some of it is looking more at, communities and, economic and social development. And, in my spare thinking time, thinking of, what national, international, sort of ideas. One is, if organizations don't embrace this kind of framework, how will they adapt? That governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as corporations, unless they get serious about this. And my belief is the innovation we're seeing is only a fraction of the innovation we could be seeing, because I still don't believe we, people in leadership and policy positions, realize the full potential of human beings, particularly when you get them together around live issues, give them confidence, support, frameworks. They don't need all that much else in order to succeed. And learning is great. We need to keep doing it, but it's like learning for a purpose, that central sense of purpose. I think that people are looking for, in their lives, that they're making a difference. But also, if you're purpose driven, and you get groups together and people together, and you're purpose driven, that's where real breakthrough change tends to occur. So those are some of the questions I still have in my mind, and believe that some of these frameworks that were developed, at that time, are really important. And one thing that really struck me about the book was I kind of remembered it as we were writing about a future to come, but we weren't particularly, we were really writing about things we'd done a couple of years previously that sort of remain relevant. So I suppose, without trying to sound modest, I'm really proud of that. And it's kind of down to Richard and David, much more than me. And my contribution, the contribution I tend to bring in were, at the practical end, really, because I'd come from business and industry, into this world. So those are my thoughts. It's still on there on Amazon, .co.uk, .com, etc. I mean, if you're interested in it, I hope you'll pick it up and buy it. Drop me a line, say what you think of of some of the concepts, ideas, and experiences that we had, because it's something that I say that I think about ever more now in my daily work as we face even more rapid transitions and that move to digitalization that we faced, at that time. Thanks for listening, and I hope it was of interest.